The January sun hung low over the Wind River Range in Wyoming, casting long shadows across the pristine snowfield that stretched like a frozen ocean toward the horizon. 29-year-old Daniel Ortega adjusted his pack straps and stared up at the face of Gannett Peak, the highest summit in the state at 13,809 feet, its snow-capped ridge glowing pink in the early morning light. He'd been planning this solo winter ascent for months, training relentlessly at indoor climbing gyms in Denver and spending weekends on smaller peaks to prepare his body for the grueling conditions he'd face. The meteorologists had predicted a 3-day window of stable weather, a rare gift in the Wyoming winter, and Daniel intended to make the most of it. His girlfriend, Amy Brennan, had driven him to the trailhead that morning from their shared apartment in Denver, her face tight with worry as she kissed him goodbye in the frigid pre-dawn darkness. "Promise me you'll be careful," she'd said, gripping his gloved hand with both of hers, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. Daniel had smiled with the confidence of youth and experience, assured by the weight of his gear and the rope coiled on his pack, thinking of the dozen successful climbs he'd completed in the past 2 years. He'd kissed her forehead and promised to call from the satellite phone when he reached the summit, never imagining that promise would go unfulfilled in ways that would change everything. The approach took him through dense lodgepole pine forests that eventually gave way to exposed granite and ice, the trail disappearing beneath several feet of snow that made navigation challenging despite his GPS unit and careful map study. By late afternoon, he'd established a small camp at 11,800 feet, melting snow for water in his tiny stove and reviewing his route for the following day on his waterproof map. The wind picked up as darkness fell, howling against his tent with an intensity that made him question the forecast he'd trusted, rattling the fabric and sending loose snow skittering across the glacier below his camp. Still, he'd come too far to turn back now, invested too much time and money in this expedition to let some wind deter him from his goal. If you're enjoying this story of survival and determination, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where you're watching from. Your support means everything to us and helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to life. Daniel set out at 4 in the morning, his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a sword through velvet, illuminating the swirling snow crystals that danced in the beam. The glacier stretched before him, its surface deceptively smooth under a blanket of fresh snow that had fallen during the night, covering any visible signs of danger. He moved carefully, probing ahead with his ice axe every few steps, but the conditions seemed stable, and the snow felt solid beneath his crampons. What he didn't realize was that the unusually warm autumn had created hidden voids beneath the surface, crevasses that should have been visible but were now concealed under thin bridges of wind-loaded snow that could collapse without warning. He was 2 hours into his climb, making good time on a moderate slope and feeling confident about his chances of reaching the summit before the afternoon winds picked up, when the world dropped out from under him without any warning whatsoever. One moment he was stepping forward, focused on the ridge above him. The next, he was in freefall, his stomach lurching as gravity took hold and pulled him down into the earth. He fell for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds before he slammed into an ice wall, tumbling and cartwheeling deeper into the crevasse as his body bounced off the walls like a pinball. His pack smashed against the walls, equipment clattering and breaking loose, his ice axe torn from his grip and disappearing into the darkness below. When he finally came to rest, wedged between 2 converging ice walls about 70 feet below the surface, the silence was absolute and terrifying. Daniel hung there, suspended in the blue-white twilight of the ice world, his body screaming with pain from a dozen different injuries. His left ankle was twisted at an unnatural angle, likely broken from the way it throbbed with each heartbeat. Blood dripped from a gash on his forehead, freezing almost instantly in the subzero air and forming tiny crimson icicles. He tried to call out, but his voice echoed uselessly in the narrow shaft above him, absorbed by the ice and snow. Nobody knew exactly where he was on the mountain. Amy wouldn't expect to hear from him for 3 days, and he'd purposely chosen an obscure route to avoid the crowds that sometimes gathered on the more popular approaches during good weather windows. The realization settled over him like a burial shroud, heavy and suffocating. He was completely alone, and nobody was coming to look for him. The first hours were the worst torture he'd ever experienced in his life. The cold penetrated every layer of his clothing, seeping through his expensive down jacket and thermal layers as if they were made of tissue paper. His teeth chattered so violently he thought they might shatter, and he couldn't stop his body from shaking uncontrollably. He inventoried his situation with the methodical focus that years of climbing had taught him, forcing his panicked mind to think rationally. His main climbing rope was gone, torn from his pack during the fall and lying somewhere in the depths below. His ice axe was somewhere above, lost in the tumble, along with one of his trekking poles. But his pack was still partially attached, caught on his harness by a carabiner that had miraculously held, and inside it were his tent, sleeping bag, stove, and emergency supplies. With numb fingers that barely responded to his commands, he managed to pull the pack around and extract his sleeping bag, a decision that would ultimately save his life in those first critical hours. Getting into it while wedged in the crevasse was nearly impossible, his broken ankles screaming in protest every time he moved, but terror and determination made him flexible in ways he'd never been before. He worked for more than an hour, sometimes hanging by one arm while he manipulated the fabric with the other, his fingers growing more numb with each passing minute, until finally he'd created a makeshift cocoon that trapped some of his body heat. It wasn't comfortable. Nothing about his situation was comfortable, but it was survival, and survival was all that mattered now. The days that followed blurred together into a nightmare of cold, darkness, and pain that tested every limit of his physical and mental endurance. Daniel rationed his food carefully, 4 energy bars and a bag of trail mix that had to last indefinitely because he had no idea how long he'd be trapped here. He melted ice against his body for water, a process that left him even colder but kept him alive and prevented dehydration. The worst part wasn't the physical suffering. Though that was considerable and constant, it was the mental battle that raged in his mind every single hour. Every moment he had to fight the urge to give up, to close his eyes and let the cold take him into the peaceful sleep of hypothermia. He thought about Amy, about his parents in Santa Fe, who'd emigrated from Mexico and worked 2 jobs each to give him opportunities, about his younger sister, who just started college at the University of New Mexico and looked up to him as her hero. He couldn't let them find his body in this frozen tomb. He wouldn't let this mountain defeat him. On the 5th day, as hypothermia began to cloud his thinking and he caught himself having conversations with people who weren't there, Daniel noticed something that would change everything and offer him the first glimmer of hope since the fall. Tangled in the webbing of his harness were 2 small lengths of accessory cord, about 15 feet each, that he'd brought for building anchors. In his pack, after some desperate searching with numb fingers, he found 3 more pieces of varying lengths, gear he'd brought for the technical sections of the climb. He also had 4 lightweight stuff sacks from his sleeping bag and tent, made from tough ripstop nylon with drawstring closures that could be cut into strips. An idea began to form in his oxygen-deprived, hypothermic brain, fragile as the snow bridge that had betrayed him, but an idea nonetheless that represented his only chance at survival. He could braid these materials together into a rope. He'd seen videos online about making improvised climbing ropes, military fast ropes, created by braiding multiple strands together to create something stronger than the individual components. If he could create enough length, if the braided cord was strong enough to hold his weight, he might be able to climb out of this frozen hell. The physics were simple but daunting. He needed roughly 70 feet of rope to reach the surface, and he had maybe 40 feet of material total if he was generous in his estimates. That meant he needed to find more material, and the only source available was his own equipment. But first, he needed to conserve his remaining strength and think clearly, which meant warming up as much as possible and eating something. He fired up his tiny stove, burning precious fuel to make hot water that he mixed with an electrolyte packet. The warm liquid in his stomach was like a miracle, bringing clarity back to his thoughts. Then he began the systematic destruction of his equipment, each cut of his knife representing a choice between comfort and survival. Daniel started with his tent, cutting the fabric into long strips about 2 inches wide with his pocket knife, the blade awkward in his frostbitten fingers. He did the same with the stuff sacks, creating narrow ribbons of nylon that he tied end to end with figure-8 knots doubled for security. From his pack's shoulder straps and hip belt, he salvaged more webbing, cutting away the padding to get at the nylon underneath. He even sacrificed his spare thermal shirt, tearing it into strips and braiding those together to add length, the fabric weaker than nylon, but better than nothing. The work kept him warm through movement and gave him purpose beyond simply waiting to die. His broken ankle throbbed constantly, swollen to twice its normal size inside his boot, but he ignored it as best he could, focusing entirely on the task at hand. The braiding process was agonizingly slow and incredibly frustrating. His fingers were frostbitten, the tips black and numb with dead tissue, making fine motor control nearly impossible. He worked by feel and memory, creating what he remembered as a 4-strand round braid from watching videos online, weaving the materials over and under in a pattern that would distribute tension evenly across all 4 strands. Each section took hours of painstaking work in the dim blue light of the crevasse. He'd complete a 5-foot segment, then test it by hanging his full weight on it, terrified it would snap and send him tumbling deeper into the crevasse where it narrowed into a crack too tight for a body. When it held, bearing his weight without breaking or showing signs of significant stretching, he'd move on to the next section, connecting them with more figure-8 knots, tripled for maximum security. By day 12, Daniel had created a rope roughly 40 feet long, far shorter than he needed, but made from every scrap of material he could find. It looked like something from a nightmare, a Frankenstein creation of colored nylon strips, gray webbing, white accessory cord, and even some strips of his thermal shirt all twisted together in an irregular braid that varied in thickness along its length. But when he tested it, pulling with all his remaining strength until his shoulders burned, it held without snapping or showing significant signs of weakness. The question that haunted him was whether it would hold while he climbed, whether the knots would slip under dynamic loading, whether the whole thing would unravel and send him plummeting to the bottom of the crevasse. He knew that 40 feet wasn't enough to reach the surface, which meant he'd have to use the rope as a tool in combination with actual ice climbing, jamming his hands and feet into cracks and irregularities in the ice walls. The technique would be brutal and dangerous, especially with a broken ankle, but it was his only option. Staying in the crevasse meant certain death from hypothermia and starvation. Attempting to climb meant probable death from falling. He chose the option that involved action, that gave him some control over his fate. He spent the next day preparing for the climb with meticulous attention to every detail. He fashioned crude ascenders from carabiners and cord, creating friction hitches that would slide up the rope but lock when weighted, a technique called prussicking that he'd practiced in climbing gyms. His broken ankle would be useless for bearing weight, so he'd have to climb primarily with his arms and his one good leg, an exhausting prospect that would require every ounce of strength he had left. He ate the last of his food, needing the calories for what was coming, savoring each bite of the energy bar as if it were a gourmet meal. That night he didn't sleep, just lay in his sleeping bag, thinking about Amy, about the life he wanted to live. rehearsing every movement he'd need to make during the climb. He visualized success over and over, seeing himself reach the surface, because visualization was all he had left. On the morning of day 14, with the sun probably rising somewhere far above in a world he might never see again, Daniel began his escape attempt with a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in. He tied one end of his braided rope to his harness with a triple-checked bowline knot, then carefully stuffed his sleeping bag back into his pack, not wanting to leave anything behind that might be useful if he somehow survived this. The temperature in the crevasse was probably around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that his breath formed thick clouds and any exposed skin froze within seconds. He looked up at the thin line of grey sky 70 feet above, so far away it seemed impossible, and began to climb. The technique was terrifyingly difficult from the very first move. He would climb the ice walls themselves, using whatever cracks or irregularities he could find, jamming his good foot and his hands into any gap, sometimes using an ice screw left on his harness as a makeshift pick. When he'd gained a few feet of elevation through pure climbing, he'd use his braided rope as a safety line, looping it around ice bollards or jamming it into cracks above him, then continuing to climb. If he fell, the rope might catch him, or it might not. But without it, he had no chance at all. Every movement had to be calculated and precise, because wasted energy meant death. Every foot of elevation cost him dearly, extracting a price in pain and exhaustion. His arms burned with lactic acid buildup, the muscles trembling and threatening to give out. His good leg trembled with exhaustion, the quad muscle cramping and spasming. His broken ankle was a constant source of agony, but he'd learned to compartmentalize the pain, to push it into a corner of his mind and ignore it. Several times he slipped, catching himself on the rope at the last second, feeling it stretch and hearing the fibers creak ominously but miraculously hold. Each time his heart hammered so hard he thought it might explode. The crevasse walls were about 4 feet apart where he'd been wedged, but they widened as he climbed, eventually spreading to 8 feet and then even wider. This made the climbing easier in some ways, giving him more features to work with and more options for hand and foot placements. But it also meant he couldn't brace himself between the walls when he needed to rest. Instead, he had to hang from whatever hold he'd found, his muscles screaming in protest while he caught his breath and planned his next sequence of moves. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but the mental challenge was even worse, requiring constant problem-solving and decision-making while oxygen-deprived and hypothermic. After 8 hours of climbing that felt like 8 years, he'd gained maybe 30 feet of elevation. The opening of the crevasse was still impossibly far above, a ragged line of grey sky that seemed to recede every time he looked up, mocking his efforts. His water was gone, his body was failing in multiple ways, but he kept moving because stopping meant dying. There was no alternative that he would accept. Going down meant death from cold and starvation. Going up might also mean death from falling or exhaustion, but at least it was action, defiance against the mountain that had tried to kill him. He chose defiance. That night, wedged into a narrow section about 35 feet below the surface, he tried to sleep while still clipped to his rope, his body screaming for rest. He'd progressed 35 feet in one brutal day of climbing, leaving him still 35 feet from freedom. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple and impossible to ignore. He had to cover the remaining distance in one more push, because he had no food, no water, and his body was consuming itself for fuel. His broken ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, the pain now a constant scream that he'd learned to push into a distant corner of his mind through sheer force of will. His fingers were black with frostbite, some of them showing no sensation at all, and he knew he'd probably lose parts of them even if he survived. But fingers could be amputated and life could continue. Dying here meant losing everything. Day 15 began with Daniel trying to stand on his good leg and immediately collapsing, his muscles having no strength left after the previous day's exertion. For an hour, he hung there in his harness, accepting that this was where his story would end, in this frozen grave. He'd tried, given everything he had, pushed himself beyond any limit he'd known existed, but it wasn't enough. The mountain had won, as mountains always won, eventually. He thought about Amy finding out, imagined the phone call she'd received from search and rescue, thought about his funeral and who would attend, thought about all the climbs he'd never do and the children he'd never have and the life he'd never live. Then, from somewhere deep in his chest, a sound emerged that was half roar and half sob, a primal expression of rage and grief. If he was going to die here, he was going to die climbing, not hanging like a piece of frozen meat waiting for the end. He reached up with his right hand and jammed it into a crack in the ice, pulled with everything he had left in his body. His body rose inches. The smallest victory, but a victory nonetheless. He did it again, finding another crack, pulling again, and again. And again, each movement an act of pure, stubborn will. Time stopped meaning anything as he climbed. There was only the next handhold, the next small victory against gravity and cold and the mountain's indifference. His braided rope dragged behind him now, still attached to his harness, a lifeline that had brought him this far through the darkness. When he could no longer pull himself up through strength alone, he'd loop the rope around ice features and use it to take his weight while he rested for a few precious seconds, gasping for air in the thin atmosphere. The final overhang nearly defeated him completely and almost ended his escape attempt. The crevasse's opening was capped by a cornice of snow, jutting inward and creating a ceiling that blocked his path like a roof. Daniel hung below it, staring up at this last obstacle with tears freezing on his cheeks, and felt despair wash over him in a wave. He'd climbed 70 feet with a broken ankle and frostbitten hands, surviving 18 days in conditions that should have killed him in the first 48 hours, only to be stopped by a shelf of snow. It seemed cosmically unfair, a cruel joke played by an indifferent universe. But snow could be broken, he reminded himself. Snow was just frozen water, and he'd survived this long by being too stubborn to quit. He reached up and punched the cornice with his fist, his hand breaking through the crust. He punched again, creating a hole, then grabbed the edges and pulled, using his body weight to break off chunks. The snow collapsed around him in a shower of white, and suddenly he was clutching at surface snow, real surface snow, not the walls of his prison, but the actual glacier under the open sky. With a final desperate heave that used the very last reserves of his strength, Daniel dragged himself out of the crevasse and collapsed on the snowfield, unable to move, barely breathing, staring up at the sky that he'd never thought he'd see again. He lay there for what might have been 10 minutes or an hour, time having lost all meaning. He'd been underground for 18 days in a frozen hell that should have killed him, and now he was out under the vast Wyoming sky. The sun on his face felt like a blessing, like being reborn into a world he'd already said goodbye to. But he wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot. He was still miles from the trailhead, injured and hypothermic and dehydrated, with no food or water and limited ability to move. The escape from the crevasse had been one challenge. Surviving the descent would be another. He allowed himself a brief rest, then forced his body to move, despite every muscle screaming in protest. His camp was somewhere nearby, if he could find it, if it hadn't been buried by snow or blown away by the wind. He crawled at first, unable to walk on his broken ankle, dragging himself across the ice using his elbows and his one good leg like a wounded animal. The progress was agonizingly slow, each foot of distance requiring immense effort. After what might have been an hour of crawling, leaving a trail in the snow behind him, he spotted the bright orange of his tent's storage bag, partially buried but still visible. He'd never thought nylon fabric could look so beautiful, like a beacon of hope in the wilderness. Inside his tent's collapsed remains, buried under a layer of snow, he found his satellite communicator in a side pocket. In his preparation for the solo climb, he'd left it in camp rather than carrying it, a decision that had nearly killed him and that he'd regret for the rest of his life. His fingers could barely press the buttons, the frostbitten flesh responding sluggishly to his commands, but eventually the device powered on and its screen glowed with beautiful green light. He pressed the SOS button, sending its emergency signal to satellites orbiting overhead, then confirmed the transmission. Then there was nothing to do but wait, huddled in the ruins of his tent, wrapped in his sleeping bag, with his braided rope still attached to his harness like an umbilical cord that had delivered him back into the world. The rescue helicopter arrived 6 hours later, its rotors beating the thin mountain air as it descended toward his location, the most beautiful sound he'd ever heard in his life. The paramedics who jumped out couldn't hide their shock at his condition, their professional composure cracking as they assessed what they were seeing. Daniel was severely hypothermic, with a core body temperature that would later be measured at 28. 3 degrees Celsius, dangerously dehydrated, with frostbite on all his fingers and toes, a broken ankle, multiple lacerations, and significant weight loss. One of them, a woman named Patricia Huang from the Fremont County Search and Rescue Team, knelt beside him and took his vitals while asking questions in a calm, professional voice. When he tried to explain about the crevasse, about the 18 days, about the rope he'd braided, the words came out slurred and confused, his hypothermic brain struggling to form coherent sentences. "You were in a crevasse for 18 days?" Patricia repeated, her professional calm cracking for a moment as she exchanged glances with her partner. "That's impossible. Nobody survives that long in those conditions." Daniel's hand moved weakly to the braided rope, still clipped to his harness, the evidence of his ordeal. Patricia picked it up, examining the makeshift construction with growing amazement, running her hands along the knots connecting different materials, seeing the evidence of desperate ingenuity. She looked at her partner, a man named Jake Russo, who'd been doing mountain rescue for 15 years, and saw her own disbelief mirrored in his face. Later, she would tell reporters that in 20 years of mountain rescue across Wyoming and Colorado, she'd never seen anything like it, never encountered someone who'd survived so long in such extreme conditions. The rope alone told a story of determination and will that defied reason and everything they knew about survival. They stabilized Daniel as best they could with the equipment they had, starting IV fluids and carefully wrapping him in warming blankets, then loaded him into the helicopter with extreme care. As the aircraft lifted off, banking toward the valley and the hospital in Lander, 40 miles away, Daniel pressed his face to the window and looked down at the glacier spreading below. From above, the crevasse was barely visible, just a dark line in the snow that you'd never notice unless you knew to look for it. It had almost been his grave, a frozen tomb that would have held his body until some future climber discovered his remains. Instead, it had become the crucible where he'd discovered exactly what he was capable of enduring, what reserves of strength and determination existed at his core. At Lander Regional Hospital, the medical team worked through the night to save his extremities and stabilize his condition, their work careful and precise. The frostbite was severe, the tissue damage extensive, but they managed to preserve most of his fingers through aggressive rewarming and treatment, though he'd lose parts of 2 toes and the tip of his left pinky finger. His ankle required surgery the next morning, pins and plates to reconstruct the shattered bones and restore some stability. But he was alive, against all odds and against everything medical science said was possible, breathing and conscious and able to tell his story to the doctors and nurses who couldn't quite believe what they were hearing. Amy arrived the next morning after receiving the call from Search and Rescue, her face streaked with tears. having driven through the night from Denver when she got the call that he'd been found alive. She held his bandaged hand carefully and listened as he described the fall, the cold, the braided rope that had saved him, the climb that shouldn't have been possible. The story spread quickly through the climbing community, shared on forums and social media, inspiring amazement and disbelief. Other mountaineers wanted to see the rope, to understand how he'd done it, to learn from his improvised survival technique. Daniel had them bring it to his hospital room on the third day of his recovery, and he laid it out on the bed, this tangled, improbable creation that looked like it should have fallen apart the moment any significant weight was applied. But it hadn't fallen apart. The 4-strand round braid, executed with frozen fingers in total darkness while hypothermic and injured, had held together for a 70-foot climb that represented the difference between life and death. Engineers from the University of Wyoming came to study it a week later, running tests in their lab, and determined that despite its improvised nature and irregular construction, the braiding technique had created a rope with a working load of approximately 800 pounds, more than sufficient for his 170-pound frame with a reasonable safety margin. The Forest Service investigated the incident thoroughly, trying to determine how a crevasse so deep and dangerous had gone undetected and whether warning signs were needed. The conclusion was that the previous autumn's unusually warm temperatures had caused extensive melting in the Wind River Range, creating cavities beneath the surface that were then covered by early winter snow. It was a rare combination of conditions, a trap waiting for the unlucky climber who happened to step in the wrong place. They placed warning signs in the area near where Daniel had fallen and recommended that the entire glacier be considered high risk for the remainder of the season, potentially saving other climbers from a similar fate. Daniel spent 3 weeks in the hospital, his recovery slow but steady, followed by months of physical therapy that tested his patience. The climbing community rallied around him with incredible generosity, raising money through online fundraisers to cover his medical expenses and replacing all the gear he destroyed or lost during his survival ordeal. But the greatest support came from Amy, who was there every single day without fail, helping him relearn to walk on his reconstructed ankle, encouraging him through the painful process of recovery, never once suggesting that he should give up climbing. One evening, about 2 months after the rescue, as they sat together in his apartment in Denver, watching the sun set over the Rockies, she asked the question that had been haunting her since the day she'd gotten the call. "Do you regret going? Knowing what happened, knowing what you went through, would you do it differently?" Her voice was quiet, carefully controlled, but he could hear the fear beneath it, the knowledge of how close she'd come to losing him forever. Daniel considered the question for a long time, staring out at the mountains that had almost killed him. The easy answer was yes. Of course he'd do it differently. He'd bring a partner, or better communication equipment, or wait for better conditions, or choose a different route entirely. But the real answer was more complicated and harder to articulate. The crevasse had shown him something profound about himself, revealed a core of resilience and determination he hadn't known existed. In that frozen darkness, facing certain death with no hope of rescue, he'd found the will, not just to survive, but to act, to create, to solve the unsolvable problem. That knowledge would stay with him forever, shaping who he was and who he would become. "I'd go," he finally said, his voice firm, "but I'd be smarter about it, more careful, and I'd make sure someone knew exactly where I was at all times." By spring, Daniel was walking again without crutches, albeit with a pronounced limp that doctors said might improve with more time and therapy. His fingers had healed remarkably well, though they remained sensitive to cold, and he'd lost some fine motor control. More surprising to everyone who knew him was his desire to climb again, to return to the mountains that had almost killed him. Many people assumed the trauma would drive him away from the sport forever, but the opposite was true. The mountains had tried to kill him, tested him in the most extreme way possible, and he'd survived. That gave him a strange sort of peace, a knowledge that he could face the worst and come through it. He respected the risks now in a way he never had before, understanding that confidence without caution could be as dangerous as any crevasse. In June, exactly 5 months after his fall, he returned to Wyoming. Not to Gannett Peak, not yet, but to the Wind River Range where his ordeal had taken place. He came with Amy, with professional guides from the local climbing school, with proper safety equipment and multiple communication devices. They hiked to the glacier where he'd fallen, and he stood at the edge of the crevasse, looking down into the blue depths that had almost become his grave. The snow bridge had long since collapsed, revealing the chasm in all its terrifying width, the ice walls descending into darkness. It was hard to believe he'd climbed out of there, hard to reconcile the narrow shaft with the memory of his desperate ascent. It seemed impossible, a story that couldn't be true, except that it was. He'd brought the rope with him, carefully coiled in his pack. Carefully, with hands that trembled slightly, he untied it and laid it out on the snow beside the crevasse. Each knot, each section of braided material represented hours of work in the darkness, hours when death seemed certain, but he'd refused to accept it. It wasn't elegant or pretty, this creation of desperation, but it had done its job perfectly. He took photographs from multiple angles, wanting to remember this moment, to document this return to the place where everything had changed. Then he carefully packed it away again, treating it with the reverence it deserved. The rope would go to a museum eventually. Patricia had arranged it with the Wyoming State Museum, a testament to human ingenuity and the will to survive that would inspire future generations. As they hiked back to the trailhead that afternoon, Amy walking close beside him, with her hand occasionally touching his arm, Daniel thought about the question people always asked when they heard his story. How did you survive? They wanted a simple answer, some trick or secret that could be learned and applied to their own lives. But the truth was that survival hadn't been one moment or one decision or one technique. It had been thousands of tiny choices, made hour after hour in the cold darkness, each one representing a decision to continue rather than quit. The choice to keep moving instead of accepting death. The choice to believe that the braided rope would hold. The choice to reach for the next handhold even when his body screamed that it was impossible. Survival had been an accumulation of small victories that together added up to something miraculous. The scars would always be there, physical reminders on his body and mental ones in his mind. His toes ached in cold weather, his ankle would never be quite right, and sometimes he still woke from nightmares of falling into endless blue ice. But he'd also gained something precious that many people never found, the knowledge that when everything was stripped away, when there was nothing left but himself and the mountain, and the choice between life and death, he'd had enough. Enough strength, enough stubbornness, enough hope, enough determination. That was worth more than any summit, more than any climb, more valuable than anything he'd ever accomplished. That was the real rescue, not the helicopter that had carried him to safety, but the discovery of who he truly was at his core. A year after the fall, Daniel Ortega summited Gannett Peak with a full team. He went in summer this time, during the optimal climbing season, with experienced guides and every safety precaution imaginable. When he reached the top and looked out over the Wind River Range, seeing the glaciers spread below like frozen rivers and the peaks stretching to the horizon, he felt a complicated mixture of triumph and humility. The mountain hadn't been conquered, not really. It had been negotiated with, respected, given its due. And somewhere on that vast expanse of ice was the crevasse that had almost been his grave, now just another crack in the glacier, slowly closing as the ice moved and shifted with the seasons. He pulled out his satellite phone and called Amy, who was waiting in Lander at their hotel. "I made it," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion, and heard her sob with relief and joy on the other end. They talked for a few minutes about the climb, the view, the feeling of standing on top. Then he hung up and sat down on the summit alone with his thoughts. 18 days in the ice had taught him that survival wasn't about being fearless or invincible. It was about being afraid and climbing anyway, about failing and getting back up, about losing everything and finding that you still had enough. It was about braiding together whatever you had left, no matter how inadequate it seemed, and trusting it would hold when you needed it most. And somehow, against all reason and probability and everything that should have happened, it did.